There's something quietly different about people who grew up reading comics in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Not just nostalgic, not just older. Different, internally. If you were the kind of kid who disappeared into comic books for hours, if those stories felt more real than school, more honest than adults, there's a reason for that. And it's not imagination. Psychology and philosophy have been pointing to this for decades, but no one ever explained it clearly. Because those comics didn't just entertain you, they shaped the way you think, feel, and survive. And today, in a world obsessed with speed, noise, and instant answers, you might feel out of place without knowing why. This video isn't about nostalgia. It's about understanding what those stories built inside you, and why that makes you fundamentally different today. Comics weren't endless feeds. They didn't scroll. They didn't refresh. They demanded presence. You had to sit still. You had to focus. You had to imagine what happened between panels. And without realizing it, your brain was doing something rare. Carl Jung called it symbolic engagement, the process of building identity through archetypes, myths, and images. While other kids consumed distraction, you were absorbing symbolic meaning. Heroes, masks, dual lives, sacrifice, responsibility. You weren't just watching stories. You were learning how a human being survives inner conflict. The first rare trait comics gave you is symbolic identity formation. You didn't just like a hero. You identified with one. Peter Parker's loneliness, Bruce Wayne's trauma, the X-Men's feeling of being outsiders. These weren't fantasies. They were mirrors. Psychologists in narrative identity research show that children who strongly identify with fictional characters develop more complex inner worlds and stronger self-concept. You learned early that strength can coexist with fear, responsibility can exist without applause, heroes suffer quietly. That's why you don't relate to shallow confidence. You were trained to live with contradiction. You learned something many adults never do, that being human means holding broken parts without collapsing. Comics also trained your empathy in a way no other medium could. You had to read emotion in still images, interpret silence, understand pain without dialogue. Between one panel and the next, nothing was explained. You filled the gap. Research in visual literacy shows that people who grew up reading sequential art develop higher emotional perception and stronger theory of mind. That's why today, you sense tension instantly. You notice when smiles aren't real. You feel things others miss. You don't just listen to words. You read people. Your empathy wasn't taught. It was trained, quietly, patiently, alone. You waited. A month for the next issue. Years for storylines to resolve. No binge watching. No instant payoff. Psychological research on delayed gratification shows that serialized storytelling builds patience, complexity tolerance, and long-term thinking. This is why modern content feels empty to you. It explains everything too fast, resolves tension too easily, assumes you can't think. But you were raised on slow revelation. You learned that meaning takes time, and that patience isn't weakness, it's depth. Here's the trait that makes you feel most alien today. Moral complexity tolerance. Comics didn't give you simple good versus evil. They gave you villains shaped by pain, heroes who failed choices with consequences. Psychologists studying moral development found that exposure to morally ambiguous narratives creates adults who think beyond tribal thinking. That's why cancel culture feels wrong to you. You look for wounds beneath behavior. You ask why instead of who to hate. You learned that people aren't monsters. They're wounded humans acting from survival. And that understanding didn't make you weak. It made you wise. And now, the deepest trait. Imagination as emotional processing. When life hurt, you didn't escape reality. You translated it. You turned pain into story, fear into metaphor, loneliness into meaning. Neuroscience shows that children who process emotions through narrative develop stronger emotional resilience. You weren't running away. You were surviving symbolically. That's why even today you can find meaning in suffering. You don't romanticize pain, but you know it shapes you. You learned the hero's journey before anyone explained it. So if you feel different, if modern culture feels loud, shallow, impatient, you're not broken. You're not outdated. You were formed differently. That depth people call overthinking, that symbolic intelligence, that sensitivity people call weakness, that's emotional sophistication. That patience people call slowness, that's narrative wisdom. For a brief moment in history, stories didn't distract us. They formed us. If you grew up on comics, you didn't just read stories. You learned how to be human. Drop a comment if comics shaped you.